Missy LeHand was the only person allowed to sit in her nightgown, sipping morning coffee and sharing every secret with the president. But that very privilege, that role of the untitled wife, is exactly what destroyed her. She poured every ounce of her life into Franklin D. Roosevelt, only to be struck down by a stroke and left paralyzed, watching in silence as the man she adored turned his back on her as if she were a stranger. She gambled her entire youth, refusing every chance at marriage or children, just to be the spine that the most powerful man on earth leaned on. It is a bitter ending for a woman who held the president's heart and the nation's secrets, yet could not save herself. Today, we will unveil the curtain of this political golden age to discover the story of the first female chief of staff in U.S. history, a woman who died of a broken heart after loving a man she could never truly have. We are stepping back into the dying breaths of the 19th century, an era where the glass ceiling for women was not made of glass, but of iron. Marguerite Alice LeHand was born on September 13, 1896 in Potsdam, New York. But this was not the New York of gilded mansions and high society balls. This was the New York of soot, struggle, and survival. She was a child of the working class, born into a family that knew the precise value of a dollar, because they rarely had enough of them. Her parents, Daniel and Mary LeHand, were the children of Irish immigrants. In America at the turn of the century, Irish need not apply was a fading sign, but a lingering sentiment. To be Irish American was to be hardworking, Catholic, and constantly fighting for a foothold on the ladder of respectability. Her father was a gardener, her mother a maid. These were hands that were calloused by labor, hands that scrubbed the floors of the wealthy and tended the lawns of the powerful. When Marguerite was still a young girl, the family moved to Somerville, Massachusetts, a blue-collar suburb of Boston. It was here, amidst the triple-decker houses and the smoke of industry, that she seemed destined for an incredibly ordinary life. The script for a girl in her position was already written. A few years of school, perhaps a job in a textile mill or a shop, followed by marriage to a local boy, a house full of children, and a life of quiet anonymity. But fate, as it often does in the stories we tell here, dealt a cruel hand early on, a hand that would shatter the ordinary script and force her onto a different path. At the age of 15, the vibrant, energetic Marguerite was struck down. She contracted rheumatic fever. Today we treat this with a course of antibiotics. In 1911, it was a sentence of terror. The fever raged through her body, attacking the joints and, most critically, the heart. For weeks she lay in a darkened room, her parents praying by her bedside, listening to the labored beating of her heart. She survived, but she did not emerge unscathed. The disease left her heart permanently damaged. Doctors delivered a grim prognosis to her parents. Her heart was fragile, prone to atrial fibrillation. She was strictly forbidden from heavy physical exertion. No factory work, no scrubbing floors like her mother. And, the doctors whispered, likely no long life. She was living on borrowed time. It was a terrifying diagnosis for a teenager, but it instilled in Marguerite a fierce, quiet determination. If she could not use her body for labor, she would sharpen her mind. She would have to become indispensable in a way that didn't require physical strength. She graduated from Somerville High School in 1917, but while others might have dreamed of university, that was a luxury her family simply couldn't afford. Instead, she entered the secretarial sciences, a rigorous discipline that was the computer programming of its day. She learned to type at lightning speed. She learned shorthand, training her hand to capture the spoken word faster than thought. And she discovered she possessed a weapon that would take her further than any degree, a memory that trapped details like a steel trap, and a social intelligence that allowed her to read a room instantly. The year was 1917. The world was on fire. The Great War, World War I, was raging across Europe, and the United States was finally stepping into the fray. Washington, D.C. was transforming overnight from a sleepy southern town into the nerve center of a global conflict. Men were being shipped off to the trenches of France, leaving a massive vacuum in the workforce. For the first time in American history, the government threw open its doors to women. They were called government girls. Thousands of young, ambitious women flocking to the Capitol to fill the clerk and secretarial positions left vacant by men. Marguerite, now 20 years old, joined this wave. She left the safety of Somerville and moved to Washington. She was striking to look at, tall, with deep blue eyes and a prematurely graying streak in her hair that gave her an air of distinguished wisdom. She landed a job at the Navy Department. In a twist of irony that historians love to point out, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy at that very moment was a handsome, aristocratic New Yorker named Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was the golden boy of Washington, charming, ambitious, and utterly convinced of his own destiny. But in the chaotic, paper-strewn offices of the Navy Department in 1917, their paths did not cross. Marguerite was just one of hundreds of typists. FDR was a man with his eyes fixed on the horizon. It wasn't until 1920 that destiny finally intervened. FDR had been chosen to run for vice president on the Democratic ticket alongside James Cox. It was a doomed campaign from the start. The country was tired of war and Wilsonian idealism, but FDR attacked it with his trademark energy. His wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, was tasked with managing aspects of the campaign correspondence. She needed someone reliable, someone sharp, someone who wouldn't crumble under the pressure of a national campaign. She hired Marguerite LeHand. This is the first pivotal irony of Missy's life. It was Eleanor, the wife, who brought the other woman into the fold. The campaign of 1920 was a whirlwind of trains, speeches, and smoke-filled rooms. For Marguerite, it was an awakening. She saw the raw electricity of politics. She saw how FDR could mesmerize a crowd. And FDR, in turn, noticed the quiet efficiency of this young woman from Somerville. She didn't just type his letters. She anticipated his needs. She knew where the files were before he asked. She laughed at his jokes, not out of sycophancy, but because she genuinely understood his humor. The Democrats lost the election in a landslide, but while FDR lost the vice presidency, he had found something far more valuable. He had found Missy. When the campaign dust settled, it was actually Eleanor who first invited Missy to Hyde Park to help clean up the correspondence. But FDR quickly realized he couldn't function without her efficiency. He soon offered her a permanent position as his private secretary at his law firm on Wall Street. It was a prestigious offer. She accepted. In early 1921, Missy LeHand was a young woman on the rise. She was living in New York, working for one of the most famous men in America. The Roaring Twenties were just beginning to roar. Jazz was in the air, hemlines were rising, and the future seemed limitless. And then, in August 1921, the world stopped. It was supposed to be a vacation. The Roosevelts had retreated to their beloved summer home on Campobello Island, off the coast of Canada. It was a place of sailing, swimming, and vigorous exercise, the things FDR loved most. But one evening, after a swim in the frigid waters of the Bay of Fundy, FDR went to bed, feeling feverish. By the next morning, his legs felt heavy. By the day after, they were numb. Panic set in. Doctors were summoned. Misdiagnoses were made. Finally, the terrifying truth was revealed: polio, infantile paralysis. The vibrant, athletic 39-year-old Franklin Roosevelt was paralyzed from the waist down. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. FDR was a man who defined himself by his vitality. He was a man of action. Now, he was trapped in his own body. He could not stand. He could not walk. He could not even turn over in bed without assistance. His political life seemed over. His mother, the formidable Sarah Delano Roosevelt, wanted him to retire to the family estate at Hyde Park and live out his days as an invalid country squire. She wanted him to rot in genteel silence. But his wife, Eleanor, and his political advisor, Lewis Howe, urged him to fight. They wanted him to remain in the public eye. And where was Missy? Missy was right there. She didn't flee. She didn't look for a more stable job. She moved into the Roosevelt household. It was in this crucible of pain and humiliation that Missy became indispensable. While Eleanor was battling her mother-in-law and trying to keep FDR's name alive in political circles, Missy became the constant companion of the man himself. She saw him at his absolute lowest. She saw the tears of frustration when he couldn't lift his legs. She saw the sweat and the agony of his rehabilitation exercises. She didn't treat him like a broken statue. She treated him like a man. This is where the dynamic shifted. Eleanor offered duty and principle. Missy offered warmth and ease. Between them, FDR found the balance he needed to function. While Eleanor reminded him of what he should be doing, Missy reminded him of who he was. The bond between them was sealed during the winter years between 1924 and 1926. FDR, desperate to find a cure, or at least some improvement for his withered legs, discovered that swimming in warm water seemed to help. He bought a houseboat, a dilapidated vessel named the LaRuco, and took it down to the warm waters of Florida. Eleanor hated the LaRuco. She hated the heat, the mosquitoes, the small quarters, and the enforced idleness. She visited briefly and then left, returning to her work and her children in New York. But FDR couldn't be alone. He needed a hostess. He needed a secretary. He needed a friend. He took Missy. For 3 winters, Missy lived on the houseboat with FDR and a small crew. It was a floating bohemian paradise, miles away from the strict social codes of New York and Washington. Here, FDR didn't have to be the statesman. He could wear old sweaters, fish off the side of the boat, and drink cocktails as the sun went down. Missy was the queen of this little kingdom. She organized the supplies. She typed his letters to the outside world. She acted as the hostess when friends came to visit. But more than that, she provided the domestic intimacy that he craved. They developed a language of their own. She stopped calling him Mr. Roosevelt and began calling him FD, a privilege granted to almost no one else. The Roosevelt children, who visited occasionally, began to see her as a fixture. They called her Aunt Missy. It was on the deck of the LaRuco that the office wife was truly born. She knew his body, its limitations, and its needs. She knew his mind, his ambitions, and his fears. She learned how to read his moods by the tilt of his cigarette holder. She also learned to suppress her own needs. On the LaRuco, life revolved entirely around FD. If he wanted to fish, they fished. If he wanted to work, they worked. If he wanted to sit in silence and watch the sunset, Missy sat in silence beside him. She was 28 years old. She was beautiful, smart, and funny. She should have been courting, dancing, and building a family. Instead, she was drifting through the Florida Keys with a paralyzed, married man almost twice her age. Was she in love? The letters from this period are discreet, but the actions speak louder than ink. She was wholly, utterly devoted. And FDR, a man who fed on adoration like a flower feeds on sunlight, basked in her attention. He loved Eleanor for her mind and her moral compass, but he loved Missy for the way she made him feel. With Missy, he wasn't a cripple. He was a captain. The sun-drenched days on the LaRuco could not last forever. The wilderness years were over, and the call of destiny was ringing from the north. As the Roosevelts packed their bags for Albany, Missy was no longer just a secretary coming along for the ride. She was an essential gear in the machine that was about to conquer American politics. But as they stepped off the boat and onto the campaign trail, the private intimacy they had cultivated was about to be tested by the public glare of the governor's mansion. The bohemian freedom of the Florida Keys was traded for the stiff Victorian protocols of New York, and Missy had to learn a new role: how to hide in plain sight. By 1928, the political tides were turning. The Roaring Twenties were nearing their catastrophic end, and Franklin D. Roosevelt was returning to the arena. When he was elected governor of New York, in a nail-biting race, it was a triumph of will. The man who had been written off as a cripple was now running the most powerful state in the Union. But as the Roosevelts moved into the drafty Victorian governor's mansion in Albany, the unconventional structure of their lives became impossible to hide. To the outside world, it was a traditional household, but inside, it was a complex triad. Eleanor, now deeply involved in her own political activism and teaching, spent only part of her week in Albany. The rest of the time, she was in New York City or traveling. This left a void in the governor's mansion, a void that Missy LeHand filled instantly and completely. Missy moved into the mansion. She wasn't treated as staff. She was family. She had her own suite. When the governor sat down to dinner, Missy sat opposite him. When he needed someone to push his wheelchair through the gardens, it was Missy's hand on the grip. It was in Albany that the term honorary daughter began to fade, replaced by something more complex. The staff began to whisper. They noticed that while Eleanor was the day wife, handling the politics, the press, and the official duties, Missy was the night wife. She was the one there when the cameras stopped flashing. She was the one who smoothed his furrowed brow after a fight with the legislature. There is a telling anecdote from this period. A guest staying at the mansion once wandered into the family parlor late at night to find FDR and Missy sitting by the fire. She was darning his socks. It was a scene of such utter domestic tranquility, such intimacy, that the guest felt they had intruded on a married couple. This arrangement worked because Eleanor allowed it to work. In fact, she encouraged it. Eleanor knew that Franklin needed constant adoration and companionship, things she, with her strict Victorian upbringing and deep insecurities, found difficult to give. Missy was the buffer. As long as Missy was there to keep Franklin happy, Eleanor was free to be herself. But for Missy, the trap was closing. She was 32 years old. She was vibrant, stylish, and intelligent. Yet her entire existence was now legally and emotionally bound to a man who belonged to another woman and to the public. In 1932, the country, crushed by the Great Depression, turned to Roosevelt. He was elected president in a landslide. When the Roosevelts moved into the White House in March 1933, they brought their unique domestic ecosystem with them. And Missy LeHand made history the moment she crossed the threshold. Never before, and perhaps never since, has a secretary held such a position within the executive mansion. She did not rent an apartment in D.C. She moved into the White House. She was given a beautiful bedroom on the 3rd floor, just down the hall from the solarium, and a short elevator ride from the president's bedroom. But her true domain was the West Wing. If you look at the floor plan of the 1930s White House, you see the physical manifestation of her power. There was the Oval Office, the seat of global power, and directly adjoining it, connected by a private door that was rarely closed, was Missy LeHand's office. She was the only person in the entire administration who could walk into the Oval Office without knocking. For the next 8 years, Missy LeHand was the de facto chief of staff, though she never held the title. The title didn't exist yet, but she invented the role. Every piece of paper that reached the president's desk went through Missy's hands first. She read his mail. She audited his checkbook. She decided which senators got a meeting and which ones were told the president was busy. She was the filter through which FDR saw the world. Ambassadors, cabinet secretaries, and generals quickly learned the golden rule of the Roosevelt administration. If you want to get to the boss, you have to go through Missy. Joseph Kennedy, the patriarch of the Kennedy dynasty and a man with a keen eye for power, courted Missy relentlessly, sending her crates of champagne and expensive gifts. He knew that a whisper from Missy in the president's ear was worth more than 1,000 official memos. Missy's power wasn't just administrative, it was psychological. FDR was a man who hated confrontation. He famously could not fire anyone. He hated saying no. He would smile, nod, and charm people, leading them to believe he agreed with them, only to do the opposite the next day. This trait was a nightmare for governance. Missy became the no woman. When a cabinet member demanded a budget increase that FDR didn't want to give, he would say, "Ask Missy." And Missy, with a steeliness that belied her gentle appearance, would deliver the bad news. She absorbed the anger so the president could remain the benevolent father figure. She also managed the back door. FDR loved secrets. He loved meeting with spies, unofficial envoys, and political fixers off the record. These names never appeared on the official visitor logs. Missy would smuggle them in through the side entrances, usher them into her office, and slip them into the Oval when the coast was clear. She held the secrets of the New Deal, the court-packing scheme, and the brewing war in Europe in her head. And she protected his greatest secret of all, his disability. In the 1930s, the American public knew the president had been stricken by polio, but few understood the extent of his paralysis. There was a gentleman's agreement with the press: never photograph the president in his wheelchair or being carried. Missy was the choreographer of this great deception. She ensured that ramps were hidden, that strong men were positioned to lift him, and that the timing of his entrances was perfect. She helped craft the image of the strong, vigorous leader while privately managing the reality of a man who required assistance to use the bathroom. To truly understand the heart of the Roosevelt White House, we must look at 5 p.m. Every day, as the sun began to dip over the Potomac, the official business of the state would grind to a halt. The secretaries would pack up, the aides would file out, and the children's hour would begin. This was FDR's sanctuary. He would retreat to his private study or the Oval Office, and Missy would take charge. Eleanor Roosevelt almost never attended these sessions. She was a woman of temperance and high purpose. She found cocktail chatter frivolous and drinking distasteful. But for FDR, who carried the weight of a starving nation on his back, these hours were essential for his sanity. Missy was the hostess. She knew exactly how to mix the martinis: 2 parts gin, 1 part vermouth, with a splash of olive brine, just the way the boss liked it. She would invite the insiders, a small circle of trusted friends and advisors. In this room, rank disappeared. They gossiped, they told dirty jokes, they analyzed movies. Missy was the ringmaster, steering the conversation away from the grim news of the Depression and toward things that made Franklin laugh. It was here that her influence was most potent. A casual comment from Missy over a martini: "You know, Franklin, I think Mr. Hopkins has a point about that housing bill," could change national policy. She knew how to guide him without him feeling guided. She was his sounding board, his audience, and his escape. FDR called her my conscience, but she was also his mirror. She reflected the best version of himself back to him. By 1936, Missy LeHand was at the pinnacle of her influence. She was featured in Time magazine. She was voted one of the best-dressed women in Washington, known for her impeccable silk gowns and manicured nails. She was a celebrity in her own right, but beneath the glamour, there was a profound loneliness. She was approaching 40. She had no husband, no children, and no home of her own. She was living a borrowed life. And then a temptation appeared. William Bullitt Jr. was one of the most dashing men of the era. He was the first U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union and later the ambassador to France. He was wealthy, handsome, brilliant, and completely captivated by Missy LeHand. Bullitt saw Missy not just as the president's shadow, but as a remarkable woman in her own right. He courted her aggressively. He took her to the opera in Paris. He sent her love letters that would make a poet blush. He offered her everything she had been denied: marriage, a fortune, travel, and a family. For a brief, shimmering moment, Missy considered it. She visited him in Paris. She tasted a life where she was the center of someone's world, not just a supporting player. Bullitt proposed marriage. He begged her to leave the White House. "Come with me," he urged. "Live your own life." Imagine the choice she faced. On one hand, a life of luxury and love with a man who adored her. On the other, a life of servitude to a president who could never truly be hers. She went to FDR. We don't know exactly what was said in that room, but we know the outcome. FDR didn't forbid her to go, but he made it clear how much he needed her. He played the ultimate card, his own vulnerability. "How will I manage without you, Missy? Who will help me?" Missy LeHand looked at the man in the wheelchair, the man who was trying to save the world, and she made her choice. She turned William Bullitt down. She told a friend later, with a sadness that echoes through history, "I really couldn't leave him. I am all he has." It was a lie, of course. FDR had a wife, 5 children, a cabinet, and a nation. But in the way that mattered most, in the loneliness of his own mind, Missy believed she was essential, and perhaps she was, but the rejection of Bullitt broke something in her. She had built her entire life around Franklin, giving up marriage and motherhood in a sacrifice that left no path back to a life of her own. She had pushed all her chips to the center of the table, betting everything on FD. She had made her choice. She had chosen the president over the husband, the mission over the marriage. But fate is rarely kind to those who martyr themselves for a cause. Having anchored herself to FDR just as the storm clouds of World War II gathered over Europe, Missy would soon find that the price of her loyalty was not just her happiness, but her very lifeblood. The romantic sacrifice of 1936 was about to curdle into the medical nightmare of the war years. She had survived the depression of the nation, but she was unprepared for the depression of her own body. By 1939, the atmosphere in the White House had shifted from the optimistic camaraderie of the early New Deal to a grim, frantic war footing. Hitler had invaded Poland. Europe was collapsing. And in Washington, a fierce debate raged. Should Franklin Roosevelt break the sacred tradition set by George Washington and run for a 3rd term? For Missy LeHand, this was not just a political question. It was a matter of survival. If FDR retired, as he often threatened to do, they would return to Hyde Park. But Hyde Park was the domain of Sarah Delano Roosevelt, FDR's mother, and Eleanor. There would be no place for an office wife in a retired life. Missy's power, her identity, and her proximity to the man she loved depended entirely on him remaining president. She became one of the fiercest advocates for the third term. She whipped votes. She managed the convention from behind the scenes. But the stress was eating her alive. Friends began to notice a change in the super secretary. The woman who had once been the picture of calm was now jittery. She was smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day. Her hands shook. She began to suffer from what she called heart spells, episodes of tachycardia where her heart would race uncontrollably, a terrifying reminder of the rheumatic fever that had marked her childhood. Doctors warned her to slow down. They told her she was burning the candle at both ends. But how could she stop? The world was at war, and FD needed her more than ever. She was his gatekeeper, but the gate was under siege. 1940 and early 1941 were arguably the most stressful years in the history of the American presidency. Britain was standing alone against the Nazi war machine. FDR was trying to push the Lend-Lease Act through a reluctant Congress, fighting isolationists who called him a dictator. The White House became a bunker. The children's hour cocktails became less about laughter and more about numb exhaustion. Missy was working 18-hour days, often taking dictation while lying on a couch because she was too weak to sit up. She was also fighting a new enemy, Harry Hopkins. Hopkins, FDR's closest political advisor, had moved into the White House. He was sickly, disheveled, and brilliant. He began to encroach on Missy's territory. He started controlling access to the president. For the first time in 20 years, Missy felt her grip slipping. She wasn't just fighting for the president's health. She was fighting for her place in his life. The psychological toll was immense. She was prone to fits of weeping. She lost weight. The vibrant woman who had graced the cover of Time magazine now looked gaunt and haunted. She was running on adrenaline and devotion, a fuel mixture that was about to run dry. It was a Wednesday evening, June 4th, 1941. Washington was sweltering in the early summer heat. The White House was hosting a small festive dinner party. The mood was surprisingly light. Perhaps it was the calm before the storm. Missy was there, dressed in one of her elegant evening gowns. She seemed in good spirits. She laughed at the president's jokes. She ate dinner. But as the evening wound down, she complained of feeling unwell. She excused herself early, something she rarely did. She went up to her room on the 3rd floor, the sanctuary that had been her home for 8 years. Sometime in the darkness of that night, the wire finally snapped. Missy collapsed. She suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage, a major stroke. When she was discovered, the situation was catastrophic. The stroke had struck the speech center of her brain. The woman whose voice had managed the most powerful office on earth, the woman whose wit had charmed ambassadors and soothed a president, was suddenly silenced. She had partial paralysis on her right side. But the cruelest blow was the aphasia. She could understand what was being said to her, but she could not speak clearly. Her words came out jumbled, or she couldn't find them at all. For the next few weeks, the White House held its breath. FDR was reportedly devastated. He visited her bedside, sitting quietly, holding her good hand. He ordered the best Navy doctors to attend to her. But as the days turned into weeks, a chilling reality set in. The Roosevelt White House was a machine designed for war and politics. It had no gears for caretaking. Missy remained in her room on the 3rd floor, a ghost of her former self. She could hear the bustle of the administration, the ringing phones, the footsteps of important men, but she could no longer participate. She was cut off. And then the dynamic between her and FDR began to change. FDR survived by sealing off painful emotions. He could close people out of his mind as easily as closing a door. It wasn't malice. It was a survival instinct for a man who could not afford to be weighed down by grief while the world burned. He began to visit less. His visits became shorter, more uncomfortable. He hated illness. It reminded him of his own paralysis, his own helplessness. Seeing Missy, the symbol of his vitality, his legs, now broken and bedridden, was unbearable to him. So he looked away. The staff, taking their cue from the president, began to treat her as a problem to be solved rather than a colleague to be cherished. The final straw came in a moment of terrifying confusion. Missy, alone in her room, was trying to smoke a cigarette, a habit she couldn't break even now. Perhaps her paralyzed hand slipped. Perhaps she fell asleep. The bed covers caught fire. Smoke began to fill the third floor. Staff rushed in and extinguished the flames before she was seriously burned, but the incident sent a shockwave through the mansion. It was clear. Missy LeHand could not stay in the White House. She was a danger to herself and a liability to the president. The decision was made. It was decided that she would be sent to Warm Springs, Georgia, for rehabilitation, and then later to her sister's home in Somerville, Massachusetts. The day she left the White House in mid-1942 was a quiet, heartbreaking affair. There were no bands playing, no press releases. The woman who had been the assistant president simply got into a car and was driven away. FDR said goodbye. He told her to get well. He promised to write. The car drove away, and the heavy iron gates of the White House clanged shut behind her. It was more than just a departure. It was an amputation. Missy LeHand had not just lost her job. She had been severed from the host organism that had given her life meaning for 2 decades. As the skyline of Washington, D.C. faded in the rearview mirror, the deafening noise of the war room was replaced by a silence that would prove far more deadly than any stroke. She was leaving the center of the universe and heading into a void. The contrast could not have been more violent. For 20 years, Missy LeHand had lived at the epicenter of the world. Her mornings began with the secrets of empires. Her evenings ended with the laughter of the president. She had lived in the governor's mansion and the White House. Her view had been the Washington Monument and the manicured lawns of power. Now, in the summer of 1942, she found herself in a small, quiet house in Somerville, Massachusetts. She was living with her sister's family. The view from her window was a gray suburban street. The phone, once a ringing tyrant demanding her attention every 3 minutes, now sat silent for days on end. Missy was technically still on the White House payroll. FDR, to his credit, paid her medical bills, which were astronomical. He ensured she had the best care money could buy. But he withheld the one thing she actually needed, his presence. She sat in her wheelchair day after day, waiting. She learned to speak again, though her voice was halting and slow. She practiced walking, dragging her paralyzed leg, fueled by a singular, desperate hope. If I get better, he will let me come back. If I am useful again, FD will call. She wrote him letters. They were painful to read, struggling, jagged scrawls, where she tried to be cheerful, tried to be the Missy he remembered. She didn't complain. She didn't talk about her pain. She asked about the dog, Fala. She asked about the war. She tried to maintain the connection across the void. Why did he abandon her? This is the question that stains the legacy of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was a man of immense public empathy. He saved the country from starvation. He fought fascism. Yet to the woman who had devoted her entire life to him, he offered a cold shoulder. Historians and psychologists have debated this for decades. The consensus is a chilling insight into the mind of a great leader. FDR was a master of compartmentalization. To survive the crushing weight of the presidency and his own disability, he had learned to shut doors in his mind. Illness terrified him. It was a mirror he refused to look into. Seeing Missy, the woman who had been his legs, his energy, his spark, reduced to an invalid, was a reminder of his own fragility. It was a reminder that the Roosevelt magic had limits. So he simply didn't look. He wrote her letters, yes. They were chatty, newsy, and utterly impersonal. They were the letters of a distant uncle, not a soulmate. He told her about the weather in Casablanca. He didn't tell her he missed her. There is a cruel irony here. When FDR had polio, Missy sat by his bed for years. When Missy had her stroke, FDR never visited her, not once. There is a heartbreaking detail from these twilight years. During her time in the White House, Missy had given FDR a watch. It was a simple, elegant timepiece. FDR wore it every single day. He looked at it during cabinet meetings. He checked it during the Yalta Conference. Even as he ignored her in Somerville, he wore her watch. He carried her time on his wrist while she ran out of time alone. In Somerville, Missy's condition fluctuated. There were good days where she could take a car ride and bad days where the depression was a heavy blanket. She followed the news of the war obsessively. She saw photos of FDR in the newspapers, looking older, grayer, more haggard. She saw new people standing next to him. Harry Hopkins was now the closest aide. A new secretary, Grace Tully, who had been Missy's assistant, was now handling the papers. The machine had replaced her. The cog had been swapped out, and the engine kept turning. As 1943 turned into 1944, Missy began to accept the truth. She was not going back. There was a moment of shocking clarity involving FDR's will. FDR had secretly altered his will to include Missy. He stipulated that up to half of his estate's income would go to her medical care if she survived him. It was a gesture of immense financial generosity. It proved that he knew exactly how much he owed her. But money is a poor substitute for love, and the provision was tragic in its own right. It assumed he would die first. On July 31st, 1944, the end came. Missy was watching a movie at a local theater in Boston when she felt ill. She was rushed to the hospital. It was another massive stroke. She slipped into a coma. She never woke up. Marguerite Missy LeHand died at the age of 47. The news was flashed to the White House. FDR was in the middle of a strategy meeting when he was handed the note. Those present said he went silent. He stared at the desk. For a moment, the mask slipped. He issued a public statement. Memories of more than a score of years of devoted service enhance the sense of personal loss which Miss LeHand's passing brings. Devoted service. Personal loss. The words were correct, but they felt sterile. The funeral was held in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It was a solemn, high-profile affair. Bishop Fulton Sheen presided. The church was packed with dignitaries. Sitting in the front row was the First Lady of the United States, Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor had flown up immediately. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, what Missy had been. Despite the complexity of their relationship, the shared husband, the shared home, Eleanor respected Missy. She knew that Missy had carried a burden that allowed Eleanor to be free. She came to pay her respects to the partner she had lost. But the president? FDR did not come. He claimed wartime duties prevented him from traveling. It was a plausible excuse. D-Day had just happened, the world was chaotic. But many of the staff felt it was a final act of cowardice. He could not face the coffin. He could not face the reality of what he had used up and cast aside. She was buried in Mount Auburn Cemetery. The inscription on her headstone was chosen by FDR himself. It reads, "She was utterly selfless in her devotion to duty." Read those words carefully. It is the highest compliment a president can pay a subordinate. But for a woman who gave her heart, her youth, and her life to a man, it feels cold. It defines her entirely by her service to him. It is not an epitaph for a woman who lived. It is a thank you note to a tool that served its purpose. FDR did not survive her by long. Less than a year later, in April 1945, Franklin Delano Roosevelt died of a massive cerebral hemorrhage, the same thing that killed Missy. Those who were with him in those final months said he was a changed man after Missy died. The spark was gone. The laughter was forced. He was lonely. He had Eleanor. He had his daughter Anna. He had his generals. But he didn't have his conscience. He didn't have the one person who knew him simply as FD. Some historians speculate that without Missy to regulate his energy, to manage his stress, and to force him to rest, he deteriorated faster. In a strange symbiotic way, they were linked. When she broke, the clock started ticking for him. Today, Missy LeHand is largely forgotten by the public. She is a footnote in the biographies of a great man. But if you walk through the Roosevelt Library, if you look at the archives, her fingerprints are on everything. Every major decision of the New Deal, every strategy of the pre-war years has her invisible ink on it. She was the gatekeeper. She was the shadow. She was the empress of the West Wing. And her story serves as a haunting reminder to us all. History is not just made by the people on the statues. It is made by the people standing just out of frame, holding the coats, remembering the names and breaking their hearts so that the giants can stand tall. This has been the story of Marguerite Missy LeHand. Thank you for watching The Empress's Tears.